Good evening, everybody. We're here at the Sanford School of Public Policy. We've got an intimate group here in person, but we've got quite a number of you on Zoom. So welcome to our Zoom audience. I'm Frank Bruni. I'm a professor here at Duke at Sanford, and this is Kim Severson, as you no doubt know. She is a national food correspondent for the New York Times now, but has had a long, rich, and varied career, including stints at the Anchorage Daily News in San Francisco. She moved around quite a bit, as those of us in our journalistic generation tended to do that, move around a lot from smaller city to bigger city to bigger city till you get to a place like New York. I have Kim here with me because I'm teaching a course at Sanford this semester called The Media and LGBTQ Plus Americans.
You're muted.
You muted? Frank, you're muted.
You are muted. No one can hear you.
Look at that. Now you can hear us?
Now,
Yes.
is that you?
Me, Kim, speaking. Did Frank just do his whole introduction without anyone hearing you?
The last thing we heard was Anchorage.
Oh, so it got muted somehow mid-course? My hands have been in my lap, so I don't,
Okay.
Are we, so I don't know.
Well, we were talking about our varied careers
Right.
at various newspapers and places, and that we were both out
Yeah,
since we
yeah,
started
yeah.
and have had varying experiences being out in the newsroom. And we're going to talk about the
Yeah.
differences between then and now.
Yeah,
Did
well,
you all
that's
hear all that? Our vast Zoom audience? Hello?
Is the sound okay now?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us know. We could have gone on for quite a while, you
Right,
know?
right.
So anyway, let's just travel back in time. You shared with my class. Is that your time travel?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's very this very kinetic. Yeah. Can you share with our audience tonight what you shared with the class about what it was like to be in a very lonely and out place in the Anchorage Daily News newsroom, like, what is that, 3.5 decades ago?
God, is that a long time ago? Yeah, in the late 80s, or in the 90s, actually, early 90s, let's say. And, you know, you and I both are products of the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, which began in 1990 when an editor from the Oakland Tribune got the Association of Newspaper Editors to do a survey of gays and lesbians in the newsroom, and then use that to say, we're here, we're queer, we're reporting the story, and off we went. So in Anchorage, I very much wanted to make a chapter of the NLGJA, but it was seriously, it was like me, my buddy Hugh, who's a gay guy, and then there was, like I said, like a bisexual woman in production who would come over and give us some support. There was like 3 of us. Although, you know, people were pretty supportive, but there just wasn't, you know, there were some closeted people we knew about who didn't want to join working in the newsroom, reporters, but 3 of us who were kind of out. Anyway, one of the things that we wanted to do was, this is back in the day when there were classified ads. This is pre-Craigslist, when you would, you know, for those of you who are young, you would buy $15 and you'd buy a few lines, like to have your garage sale or a job or sell your bicycle, and then they had personal ads, but they would not allow gay and lesbian people to put personal ads in the, buy them in the Anchorage Daily News. So we, you know, set up this meeting with the publisher, and the head of classified came in, and one of our editors, and you know, we're making our case. This would be additional revenue, and you know, it's unfair to folks who can't, you know, it's discriminatory, but also we were like revenue. And the classified manager, I can still see her to this day, said, well, we start doing this, what's next? Bestiality ads? Like literally, that was Although they did eventually start doing it and probably hugely regretted not taking any money once Craigslist decimated, the classified ad industry. But then, doing stories, then like consider
What does one say to that? What did you say when she
well, I think one of
likened
our,
you to someone who
I think
practiced
one of our,
speech?
I think we were all just sort of stunned and luckily we had a supportive editor who I think, as I recall, pushed back on that and said, that's not really what we're talking about here. And surely you don't think that, like gave her a way out. But as it was a very, there were a lot of supportive people in the newsroom, I think just didn't know kind of what to do. And I think then and now, and there was a suspicion of having gay or lesbian people write about gay or lesbian issues, that we would be too biased. And I think it's certainly I think that happened among the Black journalists who people felt like they couldn't fairly cover civil rights issues and my answer to that always has been that I don't think we should have white men covering the Senate because they would be completely biased in that. So
That is a great answer.
Right.
Yeah.
but it's changed now, right? So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it has changed. I mean, I think now there's more of a concern that if you don't have
Right.
enough gay, queer people, choose your adjective, like covering those things, you're not going to get the proper nuance. You're not going to get the correct degree of empathy. I don't know what the exact language is, but yeah, I mean, now I think sometimes, I think you had a story, in fact, that you told, I think last night in the food discussion and in my class, that even though it's not a story about gay stuff, it speaks to that current challenge, like that current challenge of casting stories in a way that makes sure you have the right eyes on them, but doesn't play into pigeonholing. Can you share that again?
The one about the profile of the Black food historian.
Yeah, no, I think that's very relevant to the discussions that go on about whether gay journalists should cover gay stories.
I mean, I think the pendulum has swung, right, from where we don't want, you're not going to be able to tell the story fairly, to which is like, again, like, but everybody else can tell the stories fairly. Like parents who have kids in school can write about education. Anyway, don't get me started on that. But now I think we've almost swung in a way to there's this concern that if we don't have, gay eyes on a story or a Black reporter, or that maybe we're going to be missing something. And certainly I think it matters, obviously, to have people from a culture reading those stories. I don't think the burden should be on them to have to write them all, because then that's also a pigeonholing. But anyway, this was a woman who was, she's 79, she's a food historian, lives up in near Charlottesville. Her claim to fish, she was back in the 60s, one of the only Black women folk singers. She was in the Saw Women folk group, and went back to school, got her PhD after she raised 4 kids, and became the expert of food of Monticello, and certainly food that the enslaved were making in that colonial period up into the 1850s. She was in High on the Hog. If you guys saw that, anybody saw that show, she was cooking mac and cheese at Monticello. And I had first talked to her like some months earlier. I'd talked to her because she's a big food preservationist, and there was a story about African-American jammers and how difficult it was for them to get a foothold in the very whitey McWhite artisan food world. And she's a preservationist, Black woman. She was, talked about the African-American canning tradition. And so she was a great source. So I was like, oh, saw her on High on the Hog. I'm like, I've always wanted to profile this woman. She's 79. She's just like incredible to talk with, hilarious. She's like, come up to my farm and we'll talk. And I thought, great story, right? So an editor said, well, should we have a Black reporter do that? Is Kim the right person to do that story? And we'd been through this with some other stories. And, it's not like our food staff has a giant selection of African-American reporters who want to even do that story. I mean, to think that the Black reporter would have to go write about the Black food person also is reductive in my mind. But this idea that this is exactly the kind of story that I've done, I've written a lot about this subject anyway, it would just be right in my wheelhouse, and was a slam dunk of a story. And one that I discovered, or wanted to write about, but we had to tap our brakes. And that, I think, caused this big discussion at the paper about, using that idea that people from a certain culture need to be on a story about that culture as a real blunt instrument, because I think there's nuances here, right? So,
Well, it also can turn a gesture. I mean, it's meant as a gesture of respect, but it can actually be a gesture of reductionism in a certain,
absolutely,
you know?
I think so. I think so. I mean, obviously I want to do, and I wrote the stories. I think it's a really fun story. The woman's name is Lenny Sorenson. Are we on mute still? Oh, no, we have, hello, okay. But her name is Lenny Sorenson, and she's just a terrific person if you want to go read more about her. And but yeah, I think it's incredibly important. Like, I think there were many stories about the gay and lesbian community, and particularly just even the language around what they would use, or people sort of misunderstanding, how things work, or it's like the focus a little on the actual sex of gay, like they're just stuff that we would not have had a gay person or an ally read that, they would have been, and I think we're going through it now with issues of gender for sure. As we change that language, like they, them becoming, like, when does that become an accepted usage in the New York Times? We would reflect culture coming, not everybody is going to be comfortable with that. I would bet that in, I don't know, what do you think, 5 years it'll be common in the paper, 2 years?
I think so. And I think journalism, certainly the New York Times, all of journalism always struggles with, to what extent are you reflecting the culture and to what extent are you leading the culture?
Right, exactly.
And I think it's changed from issue to issue and from
Mhm.
time to time, and there's no one answer. And I think outsiders always feel like, how come you don't have these answers or this process down pat?
Mhm.
But I think the nature of journalism, it's the rough draft of history for a
Right.
lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is it kind of happens day to day, week to week. Decisions are made in particular circumstances, and usually people sitting down in some sort of committee and trying to come up with a list of rules that make sense for all circumstances, that lags well behind.
Right. And we're not editing the paper for an extremely woke audience, and we're also not editing it for a religiously conservative audience. But we do have those kind of readers. So, and we have all kinds of readers, right? And we want to bring people, we just want to tell what's going on. And if we need to use the language that's happening now to tell it, that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yes.
People in the community are using they, them, gender and trans issues are becoming very prominent in culture. And so how we cover it's going to reflect that, right? You can't cover it by not using the terms that people that we're covering are using.
Yeah.
But you can also let people define how we cover news. So that's why it's like, I'm sure people would have loved for us to have described President Trump in more derogatory terms, and people would think that we were also, should have called Hillary Clinton other things than we did, or been, but we're not editing for those people, right? We're trying to edit as best we can see it at the moment in front of us, right? And so, but I don't think we can just report on a community if we don't use the language that they're using, they, them, and,
I think that's right. And I think, and I don't think you can report on a community if no one from that community is represented in the newsroom.
absolutely.
So, well, I don't think we should ever get into like, this kind of person must cover this kind of story.
Mhm.
We get kinds of stories. We get stories we wouldn't see,
Mhm.
and we get better versions of stories when we can send ambassadors into those communities, and engender trust. I mean, I think to go back in time again, when I was at the Detroit Free Press from 1990 to 1995, I did many, many stories on people with AIDS. I did many, many stories on that sort of stage of the gay rights movement. And that was a time, not that long ago, but long enough ago, where I think if I'd gone to do those stories, and I hadn't presented either explicitly or they could just figure it out as a gay reporter, I don't think I would have gotten as many of those stories. I don't think I would have gotten the degree, the level of intimacy
Mhm.
I got in the interviews. And that was a real resource for the paper. And it's one of the reasons we talk a lot about diversity in organizations, period, but also in news organizations. I think diversity is important for a whole bunch of reasons, including you get more news, you get better news
Absolutely.
when you have different eyes on it, when you have people who can earn trust in different communities, don't you think?
Right. And or just tip us off to stories like, did you know this thing's going on? I heard this at, my dinner party full of gay people, or,
Right.
and and I think, like you said, that like, if we have a Black reporter on the streets of Ferguson, there's a way people are going to feel comfortable because they know that reporter gets it and gets what that experience is to be a Black American. And that, I think it's essential that we have people of a community, particularly community under stress, be in there, I mean, it's not unlike, we've been in Me Too reporting, it sometimes could be more difficult for a man to talk to a woman who's a victim than a woman. I think telling those stories is a certain trauma to telling them in the first place, to like having to recount this horrible thing and you're essentially going public with it. And I think for some people doing it with a man might have been more challenging, I think sometimes. And I don't think there's a strict rule you can make about this, right? Because reporters are different people. Some have different skill sets. Some people, like I do not want to write about gay and lesbian community. God bless them if I can help it. It's just too, I know it's like too.
Why?
ah,
Wait, can I interrupt you for 1
all
second? I
the
want to make sure.
Lesbians don't like it. and they
Wait,
gotta
1 second. I
process
want to
and-
make sure the Zoom audience knows we're going to pivot to questions from you. So
Yes.
if you use, I'll give you a warning. If you use the chat function, someone here is going to funnel those questions to us. And so you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. I hadn't made that clear at the start, and I just wanted to make sure that was
Yeah,
clear.
send your questions in.
Forgive me for interrupting. You were
No,
saying.
it's all right. It's just like I know, I don't want to hear people complaining about how we didn't do that right, or, you should have written this, and it's almost like I'm much better when I'm in a community that I know something about, but still I'm curious about. And I'm just not as curious about the gay community because I'm in the gay, you know what I mean? It's just feels.
Well, you can be too close to something
Yeah,
to
and
really
I-
bring the right journalistic
And I
sense.
know what's going to trigger certain aspects. And it's a challenge to be journalistically down the middle and kind of know. It's a lot of extra work in a way, just to keep the noise out. But I don't think I feel that way about the trans community, because I'm just learning a whole lot. And I have a child who's a teenager who's non-binary, and am learning tons. And I have a curiosity, and I know I have a lot to learn in that area. And I kind of can walk in as a reporter with much fresher eyes and ears, and, open heart, and understand this new thing.
So if I were your editor right now and I said, I want you to write the story that most grabs your interest, the thing you're most curious about among trans Americans, what story would you write? What are you most curious about?
Well, because I'm experiencing it as a parent, I think well-meaning parents with their trans kids, how do you defend them? When do you make the decisions to allow your teenager to begin a transition if that's what they want to do? How do you talk to your family about it? Like, it's a unique new place a lot of us are in. And I'm, struggling with that. So I think that's interesting. I think the like education, the bathrooms, the girls, boys education. And I think even it'd be interesting, again, because my child was going to an all-girls school, because we had a real belief in gender, single gender education, particularly for girls in that middle school age. Does that go out the window? Was like the education, there are big schools of thought of education on how you would educate boys versus girls, and the differences in how they
What
learn.
does a girls' school do if a girl in that school transitions?
Well, right now, because there are a few other non-binary kids in their school, the policy now is when you are accepted, the gender you are when you're accepted is, and if you transition, that's fine. But right now it's what the gender you were when you were accepted, which is a girl, they're not going to kick you out if you're in, But certainly if somebody came and said, I'm non-binary and I want to go to the girls' school, that I think is where the rubber would hit the road, because they'd have to make a decision to not accept.
Do you think this is all new to me? I mean, the girls' school question, but it's a very fascinating one because it's a metaphor for a lot of other things. Do you suspect there will be, over time, if this happens multiple times in a school, would there be any pushback from other parents? Do you think the school is going to have some challenging currents to navigate?
It's so new. I would imagine that if so this goes to high school. So like, would you start doing a full, it gets into biology a little, it gets into hormones, right? So girls can compete if someone's in transition, there are levels of hormone, levels in your body that you would begin to change in a transition chemically, medically. And there's a point at which, and that's what all these ridiculous arguments in state legislatures are about, like, when do you have so much testosterone that you should compete as a boy and you will be beating all the girls because you have more testosterone? Like that weird question. It's almost like angels on a head of a pin argument. But I would imagine there might be some questions around that if a girl's transitioning and they end up in a sports situation, or parents argue that now they are fully a boy and I don't want the boy in the school. I mean, it's all very new territory,
Very new, yeah. Yeah.
so, or will they make room for trans kids? Maybe if you're non-binary, there's room for you, but if you fully trans and identify as a boy, there won't be room for you. And it's fascinating, I don't know. We'll see. I just feel like we're on the edge of this new thing.
So I want to ask you a couple of questions
Kind of
about.
far afield from our journalistic subject, but
No, we aren't. This is because journalism will be covering all of this.
it will.
I mean, and I want to ask you where you think journalism still has a lot of room to improve when it comes to LGBTQ plus stuff. What still kind of puzzles or frustrates you. But before that, to do something happier, when you arrived yesterday, when I saw you, I picked you up, you came into the car and you had a New York Times,
All right.
copy of the print New York Times folded in your hand. And you were very excited, I think for really good reason. And you wanted to show me this front page story that was so on point to what we're talking about.
Mhm.
Can you tell people about that story and why it just pleased and rocked your world so much?
Sure. So this was the Sunday front page print edition, although, we saw it on digital too. And the centerpiece story was about the childcare, the dichotomy of childcare, and how you have to work harder to get enough money to have childcare, but like you can't afford childcare, and that whole loop of, how do you find good childcare? It's so incredibly expensive. You have to work really hard to keep your child in childcare. It doesn't make sense. So it was just a big story about that issue. And the lead picture was a mom getting a kid from school and tying their shoes or something. And it said, I can't remember the name, Janet Smith picks up her school. Her wife works 12 hours to pay for their daycare. And it was just not a blink of an eye that it was a lesbian couple with a child. And that was the example in this daycare story. And I thought, just for that to be so matter of fact, for an editor to select that and not be like, I don't know if we can put a lesbian on the front page, and no explanation, and not like, calling them out because they're gay and that's why the story. So it's fantastic. It was just exactly what I think how it should be.
So a couple, it's funny, I had one of those moments like, wow, this is how it should be. Again, with lesbian subject matter essentially, but the Times, I wish I had it in front of me. I wish I had the woman's name, but the Times ran an obit by our friend Kit Seeley about a very prominent, really well-known advocate for the deaf who had died, right? And it turned out she was not only deaf, but she was lesbian. The way you learned that in the story, and then you were off to the races, was in that kind of third or fourth sentence where it traditionally says, is survived by, right? It said, is survived by her wife, etc. And on we went. And it wasn't like, now everyone must take a pause and digest that we're talking about a lesbian here. It was that same sort of what back in the day when it was even more unusual was called mainstreaming, right? It was something you made a big point of doing. And I remember when I was working at the Detroit Free Press from 90 to 95, a newspaper that was way ahead of the curve on this stuff. And I just felt enormously privileged to work there. I remember once getting into this thing because they had run, the feature section had run a Valentine's, every time Valentine's Day was like Thanksgiving, like how do we come at this a new way, right? And they decided they would just do a feature on May-December romances, the challenges of May-December romances. And they used 3 couples and 2 were heterosexual. And one was, I can't even remember whether it was 2 women or 2 men, but they tried to do that thing where we're not going to draw any attention to it. We're not going to ever. A friend of mine had been up in the photo department and the photo editor, and had seen the photo editor take a physical, I think there was no online copy of the paper then, take a physical copy of the feature section, throw it down on his desk and say, this is disgusting, we shouldn't be doing that. came back and told me, I'm not someone who causes a lot of trouble. I was troubled enough by it. I went and talked to him. But I mean, that was a thing then. I mean, people, highly placed editors disagreed about it, didn't know what to do
felt
about
very
it.
comfortable saying.
And yeah,
This is not, it's a family newspaper. We can't.
the
put that
things
in a
we're
family
talking
newspaper."
about show how far, how
It's
much this has
unbelievable.
changed.
Do you remember what he said to you?
When I went and talked to him,
Did you go talk to the guy?
I did, and he apologized, but I think he apologized for some of the same reasons someone would right now, because I think he was worried
Like a certain
that
football
professionally
coach, for
that, I mean,
example? Yeah.
things were enlightened enough at the Detroit Free Press then that I think he realized,
That was.
as a matter of professional protection,
Yeah.
it would be better to apologize and say, I don't know why I said that or why I did that,
Mhm.
than it would be. But I don't think he was someone who left that encounter with me educated in any meaningful way or changed.
So say a photo editor at the Times did that now and said, this is disgusting that we put this lesbian on the front page. Do you think they would be fired from the
I think they'd be
Times?
out of a job,
Yeah,
yes.
I do too, which is the real difference.
It's a huge
You know.
difference, yeah.
And I think homophobic slurs being seen as equally hurtful as a racial
Right.
slur. I think that's come up, and papers are reflecting that,
Right.
so that when there's a hate crime and they, they yelled a racial, a homophobic slur at a person, it's starting to get the same weight in reporting.
Right.
I mean, you obviously never want to compare oppressions,
Right.
but in terms of how you handle the invisibility of violence against gays and lesbians, it's kind of its own unique thing, and I think is changing some.
But I think it's important to say, I think that person would be out of a job, not because, in this instance, because the Times doesn't believe in free speech. I don't think that person would be out of a job because of any kind of thought crime, like because the person
Mhm.
thought that way. I think that person would be out of a job because saying that out loud that way is having an effect on a work atmosphere. There are people who, if they hear of that, if they know of that, if they saw that, are less comfortable, who do
Right,
not
it
feel
creates
well.
a hostile work
So I
environment.
think that person would be fired, lest this, lest this statement of ours become some sort of like right-wing weapon.
Right.
I think that person would be fired for human resource reasons
Right, it's
more
hostile
than
workplace.
for
Exactly.
political thought crime
Yeah,
reasons. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. Thank you for making that point, because that's the thing is I mean, can you imagine blurting something out like that now about anybody, and that your coworkers could, that you would be allowed to make a statement like that? Like, I can't believe these women get to come in here and write the news anymore. It's terrible. Like you just wouldn't do it anyway.
I want to go to any questions that
Yeah, let's go to
people understand.
questions.
But wait, before I want to ask
Let's go
you
to the phones. Oh, I'm
or I
sorry.
want to ask you one thing first. So we're talking about how far things have come.
Mhm.
Where do you still get super frustrated, if anywhere? Like, where do you see acres of improvement yet to be made by the media when it comes to coverage of LGBTQ plus people?
Well, I think we're starting to see more coverage about, violence against transgender people. Like, I think the whole like the gender issue is a place I think we need lots more coverage of, and different kinds of coverage, and not, some of it's kind of, people are just doing primary colors, like they used to do with gays and lesbians, like the issues, there's not subtlety there yet, or there's not really an understanding of how these issues are playing out, like I said, like in education, or, more the subtleties. You have the, it's a culture war issue now, and you're seeing it come up like in legislatures and that sort of thing. And then there's starting to be some more coverage about violence, I think, against trans women in particular. But I often thought that, I think that tension between, or the change with the gay and lesbian community, who are used to being like something that's your sexuality, and then gender. I mean, there's sort of different issues all under the queer umbrella. And I think those subtleties people don't, understand, I think, as much. There's some real generational differences, I think, is very interesting. I know a lot of women, sort of like me, are more on the butchy non-binary side a little bit, or women, who are really saying, God, if I was, who are 50, 60, 70 now, if I was a younger person now, would I have become non-binary? Am I okay being more on this side of the spectrum? Like some of those subtle issues from the gay and lesbian, I don't know if it's true for men I don't know, you may have thought, not that I think you're, but I don't know, I think there's a lot of subtleties to this and very interesting debates happening that somebody who's your average sort of straight cis reader might have no idea is going
I mean,
on.
it leads to some very interesting and nuanced and sophisticated journalism, like at
Mhm.
times. I mean, I
Which is
think,
why you need a beat reporter
Yeah.
who knows this and develops some sources and some trust.
did you see the video that the opinion
Mhm.
section did about the trans runner?
No.
It was, I mean, this was interesting. It was because you're talking about like moving beyond primary
Mhm.
colors. It was extremely interesting because um, they were very cognizant of, and the context was the sort of athletic debate,
Mhm.
and it was almost done entirely in, it was a trans female runner, and she was talking about how much she loves Trump. It was all in the first person. And she was saying, I don't know if I have a competitive advantage or not. And it was very powerful to hear her say, like, she wasn't speaking political talking points. She was kind of wrestling with it herself. But there were all these images of her running and her joy of running. And you realize by the end of it, in a very kind of deft and subtle way, this is a human being who wants to run.
Right.
This is not a human being who wants to be a political pawn.
Right.
And that message was made so clearly, but not with such a trumpet blaster. And I thought it's just interesting to see journalism grapple with this in some ways
Mhm.
where you really think, wow, I have a lot of respect for the people who produce this, because this is so thoughtful and so subtle, and it's navigating these currents with such dexterity,
Mhm. And I think that gets to what our job is, which is to reflect what's happening. We're not referees, we're not trying to say this should happen or that should happen. We're reflecting at our base of our job is to reflect what's happening in culture, the first draft of history. And that's by giving voice to people in a non-judgmental way and just saying, this is an interesting story. We're going to tell you this story about this
Right.
human who you walk on the earth with. That's kind of our job,
Right,
right?
we'll introduce you to this human, then you decide.
Yeah.
Now that you know the people, now that you know the stakes and the people involved
Mhm.
better, let this inform your judgments. your
Because we're
opinions, yeah.
we're in the we're just saying business, like we're just saying.
Well, unless you write opinion columns, then it's a little
That's
different, but yeah.
that's your
Um,
world, not mine.
Do we have some questions from the Zoom audience? Okay, I'm not texting friends or playing on my phone. This is the method by which I'm going to receive questions. So
I feel so risque showing my face, but I'm going to put my mask.
it's a good face.
I'm getting some good story. I haven't thought about this stuff in this way. It's very interesting.
Okay, here's a great question from the Zoom audience. Progress for LGBTQ individuals has happened more quickly than for other minorities because we show up in their families. And do you think this will hold true for other minorities as we see an increase in interfaith and interracial domestic relationships?
So the idea is that homophobia lessened because my daughter was gay and she got married and I really love her wife. And so I'm, in the way that my, Black son married a white woman and now I know a lot more about white people. Like, is that question, the idea of the
I
question?
I think that's part of it, but I think the other part of the question is, you found yourself with a gay or lesbian brother or sister or son or daughter. And so the reality of that person's potential or actual oppression was right there in
Mhm.
your family.
Mhm.
As there's more intermarriage and your family includes a Muslim person, a
Right,
Black person,
right.
will that help people get over their indifference or perhaps their actual kind of racism or
I
Islamophobia?
guess, I think yes, but I am kind of troubled by the idea that the numbers, I think there's probably a whole bunch more intermarriage with religions and race than there are families with gay people, maybe, because I just think the number, I think a lot of that's already
Happened, yeah.
happening. Anyway, so that's the premise is kind of troubling me because I don't think we're comparing things, but I think absolutely when you know someone of a culture that you are unsure of or have prejudice of, and then you know them in your dinner table, of course it changes, I think. But who was it?
Can I ask an
Which one of the
anecdote?
Bushes kept saying they had a Mexican American daughter-in-law or something, and they
Well,
were,
Jeb has a
his wife is Mexican American.
she's I forget exactly. Yeah, but yes,
Or
yes.
or
Is
possibly
she
born in
Mexican American? Yeah, Mexican American. Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, I remember that, and I'm not sure that Jeb Bush is less
Well, and his son, George P. Bush, has become a kind of Trump-loving,
so-
Trump-massaging, because that's what a young Republican feels he or
is
she
the
needs
thing.
to
So
do, or
I
they
don't
need
know.
to
So
do.
maybe
yeah.
that blows the theory up. Of like-
Let me ask you an annex of the reader's questions. That's of the Zoom members' question that has always confounded me. I do believe the kind of conventional wisdom that one thing that has maybe the main thing that has helped LGBTQ progress is you have a gay uncle, a gay brother, a lesbian sister, whatever. And so the stakes are clear to you and you care about the protection of people you love. How come that hasn't worked better for women's rights and feminism? Everybody has a mother.
Right, right.
Lots of people have sisters or daughters, and yet I know plenty of men in those situations who seem more than unconcerned
Right.
with the plight and the opportunities for women. So why does that fall down? I mean, that's a direct analogy to the
You
gay
wanna
thing, right?
Talk about sexism. I think because that is just so woven so much more tightly into our culture. And everybody does have a mother who probably was the one who did the laundry, even though, and because men still are not stepping up and doing I mean, I think we're in the shift where it was women's rights and women pushing for it to change. And I think we're at a place where, we can't change, men have to change, and it's like that whole thing about, this is a little different, but I was of the era of, we did take back the night marches and we learned self-defense against rapists and we were going to stop rape. And now the new young generation, they're like, you know how you stop rape? Stop raping. You guys just stop raping. And that's how we're going to stop rape. And it was like, whoa, what? Like we've been swimming in this toxic water for so long. And I think it's like that with sexism as well. I think it's just, we have been in this toxic water for a long, long time. And I think it's harder because it's more prevalent, maybe. I don't know. What do I know? I'm a journalist, not a social
No.
scientist.
I mean, I don't want to just go to the Zoom audience. Do you have a question?
Yeah. When you were speaking about reflecting back culture, are there any points at which in stories you've seen that it's gone past reflecting back culture and how you handle that in the newsroom? Do you all care not to say anything? Or
So you mean if I saw a story that was particularly had a bad run of homophobia in it, or they miscast something or something was really offensive, did I say something about it? That's the question. We were talking about this one. It was sort of easier and harder when I was a younger reporter because the issues were the stuff they would say was much more egregious, and they would just be like, like it was just clearly some stereotype about, a lesbian or whatever that was in, and I was able to be like, and a lot of times I would joke. I remember joking about it and then feeling like, kind of, why can't I just say this sucks? Like I'd be like, what do you think? We all like football? Come on, or whatever, like it was probably ineffectual, but I think I was a young person and reflected that I didn't have much power. When we were at the New York, and then as coverage of gays and lesbians got more sophisticated, and I was at more sophisticated papers, it was hard, like it just creeped in weird ways that it was so much more disappointing. And Susan Sontag's Obituary is an example. She was partnered with Annie Leibovitz, but sort of in a generation, they were sort of closeted about it. At least her family didn't want to talk about it. So we wrote a whole obituary of Susan Sontag without mentioning that she was gay or that her famous partner. And actually now, as I recall, I think it was Annie Leibovitz's camp that didn't want her name mentioned in that. Now that I remember, they were very, Annie Leibovitz was very controlling.
Wasn't there
in
an
her-
issue too with Sally Ride's obituary?
Oh, that's right. Sally Ride, that's right. And the family, so Susan Sontag's family would not confirm her orientation. And so our editors said, well, we can't just say, and I think it comes out of a place of not wanting to, an old school thing of not wanting to out people. And so, they would never say that someone was gay unless the family, the person wanted it. So it's weird. I think it was a weird holdover from that era, maybe now that I think about it. But I mean, my God. And so we went in a small group of us to talk to the obituaries editor, and we're like, who at first was like, well, family didn't want, what am I supposed to do? And came around eventually. And I think we did actually amend that obituary.
Yeah. The obituary situation has been kind of interestingly contested ground, and there's a very, what?
I said that was a good question.
There's a very famous case, and I wish I could remember his name right now, but one could kind of find it with certain of these search terms, but the Washington Post went through this long process that later generated many articles about the process when this Iraq war vet died. And he had been gay. He was a decorated Iraq war vet, and he was gay. And it was fairly known among his comrades, and he had actually done a little bit of activism within the military around the whole don't ask, don't tell stuff and all of that. But they couldn't find, he had no family members, no surviving partners, no one to guide them on whether or not he would want this in his obit. And it had certainly never been public before. And the decision was ultimately made not to put it in the obit, but that was so quickly parsed by other news organizations that it became a decision that was futile in the end.
Because everybody was out.
But it was really, really interesting because there were many gay activists who were furious about this. I recall a very angry Andrew Sullivan column about it. But I think the media was yeah, well, but I think the media was operating from an impulse of respect. Like, how do you respect this individual? Where do individual rights and kind of civic concerns begin and end? It's tough stuff sometimes. I mean, it's easy to kind of sit here and talk about this stuff. It's really tough to be in an editor's chair, I think, and to make these decisions. And sometimes I think when we all get in our media critic mode, we start to lack empathy when it comes to, I know it sounds a weird concept, but empathy for newspaper editors, right?
Well, and I think the work is, we still have to do the work in newsrooms. And I think it comes out of people being not sure as opposed to homophobic. They just don't, they are mostly kind people who just want to do the right thing by the news, and they're a little awkward about how to ask the question, or, I mean, and so I think it's still incumbent upon people who are trans, gay, lesbian, queer in a newsroom to make it okay for people to ask a question and to lend a hand, even though I know it's not on us, it's your problem, you have to work on it, but I'm not sure that's a real life solution, or it's not giving people the benefit of the doubt. And I think that, I think we can demand that these editors do better, which we should, but also I think you get to your final goal closer by being, you want to ask a lesbian? I'm here. Ask me lesbian questions.
I'm so glad you said that, because I often worry that we can sometimes adopt positions of such, of what seem to be such moral purity, that everyone around us shuts up and doesn't do what actually is needed to, which is fumble their way toward greater understanding, because they're afraid that when they fumble or when they stumble, the cost of it will be so high. I remember, and if I haven't said this in print, I've said it at microphones before, but I remember being really concerned within a year. Everyone forgets how late in the game President Obama actually came out for marriage equality. It was 2012, right? And Joe Biden forced his hand and speeded the process. Hillary Clinton isn't on the record for marriage equality until early 2013. And it seemed to me that by 2014, like, that train moved so quickly that by 2014, I'm reading descriptions of a 68-year-old Baptist woman in Alabama who opposes marriage equality as some irredeemable, horrible bigot. It's like, doesn't she deserve a little bit more time if she's only a year behind Hillary Clinton?
Right, thank you.
And I just kind of like, our desire for the most just world possible, I worry that sometimes we don't create allowances for human perfection in a way that will actually help us get there faster. Does that resonate for you at all? Or?
I think that's true. I think that's, and again, like you say, that the newsrooms are fumbling toward accuracy, and we stumble a lot. That's why we correct things. And I think it's giving people the benefit of the doubt, and helping make the final thing better by putting your own step aside is the way to go on changing this, at least in our newsroom world.
I have some more questions.
All the young people are going to say we're just wimps and chickens, and we should get in there.
Here's a what does coverage of the new Dave Chappelle stand-up special on Netflix illuminate for us?
I will tell you one interesting thought about that, is that it brings up this notion of cultural offsets, like carbon offsets. And I think Netflix has made the argument that, look, we have done an incredible job covering trans issues, doing scripted content that includes trans characters, as well as, and so we have shown that. And then this is the other side, and we know that's over here, but we have done, like, you can't,
That's your carbon offsets analogy
you
is
can't have like a
hilarious.
social offset, like a social carbon offset, right? So I think that's been super interesting to me. And I do think, though, it's hard to, comedy pushing like we came into an edge here, and maybe that shows like he stepped over a line because culture has really changed a lot, and the trans issues are so moving so fast, and thank God. But I think Dave Chappelle let us see where we are culturally, but anyway, that's my thoughts about that whole thing.
I want to read a.
Do you have a thought about that? No.
No, I want to read a comment, but thank you. I want to read a comment from someone. It's just an interesting reaction to comment about our discussion about why men aren't better on women's stuff because they've had women in their lives forever. Someone makes the good observation. I think we have so much enforcement of Title IX in sports because adult males have children who are female. They want the same for their female children as they want for their male children. I think it's a really interesting comment.
I will tell you, having a kid, and we play a lot of rec softball, and it's mostly softball dads. And they come up against, oh, wait a minute, we got to be on the crappy field, and the little league guys get the good fields. Like, you could just see them, like, because they're daughters. I think there's really something to that. There's nothing more like the newly, new feeling injustice anew in a softball dad is something to watch. I will say that.
I see it with one of my brothers with his daughters in soccer. I
Mhm.
think he's become a feminist through soccer, right?
Right. You're like, how they get paid this much and the guys get what?
Right.
The scholarships are this much and the guys are this. Yeah.
Somebody
Thank you,
asked,
Title IX.
somebody asked in terms of that fumbling your way to learning and fears of fumbling your way, how much do you think those fears have to do with cancel culture and the internet's ability to let people how much does that have to do with cancel culture and the internet's inability to let people be imperfect?
I would think it's turbocharged. I think it was always kind of there, like it's just awkward you didn't know how to ask the person what the question, but it's certainly turbocharged it, I think. But in the same way, maybe advanced it, because now, like in our we're actually having this discussion. How do you ask somebody, how do you, what's my job to go out and figure out the question I don't know about a particular segment of the Black community? And when is it just lazy to go, hey, my Black colleague, tell me about this? Like there's there's both of those things can be true. It's on me as the white reporter to figure it out, not on the poor Black person to do all the labor. But at the same time, that's how I'm going to learn it. And that's, I think we're really having that discussion. So while it has had an incredible chilling effect, like I say that these things can be used as blunt instruments, but I think ultimately we're getting to a place where we're taking, cultures I don't know about, I'm taking responsibility for learning, and I'm feeling more comfortable because now my newsroom is more diverse of talking to people, it's interesting. Do you remember that Orange County Register? They had a great column for a while. He's now a columnist for the LA Times, but he had a column called Ask a Mexican.
Yeah, it's still, that column is still,
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of moved on to have this great Metro column for LA Times, but I thought that kind of thing is ahead of its time. And I think we need more, ask a lesbian, ask a homos, whatever.
I have to give huge snaps or props or whatever the right phrase is to our Zoom audience. Not only are these really smart observations and questions, but great writing. The internet's inability to let people be imperfect. I like that. And that does concern me. Yeah. What advice do you give or have to new LGBTQ people entering journalism now? And what do you feel you are learning from new young journalists?
You start with that.
What comes to mind first, it's not a direct answer, is well, one of the things, I wouldn't say learning, but one of the discussions that new journalists have really encouraged, one of the sort of kind of discussion is not the right word. I'm fumbling myself here, but new journalists, young journalists are asking some really fascinating questions about where the goal of objectivity should end, and where certain other moral concerns should begin. Like this whole question, and the Trump era turbocharged it, to steal one of your verbs. But I think young journalists also ask this question in a very interesting and urgent way. This desire for objectivity, or this kind of pantomime of objectivity, or whatever you want to call it, at what point does that become a moral cop-out? And I don't have the answer to that, but it's an interesting question that I think is being asked more frequently and being discussed more earnestly, absolutely because of young journalists who have understandable trouble understanding the long extant paradigm of, I write this with no opinion, I give oxygen to all sides equally, I'm just a bystander here. I still feel that kind of principle or ideal very much in my blood because we were trained that way. But I totally get, and I appreciate being made to get, how morally perverse that can seem in certain situations. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting because the kids today, and it's good. I think it's pushing us to really consider, the Edward R. Murrow, we'll just give you the news today. But in that, we've always made decisions about, the moral, but, I mean, I think that where that line, what is morally okay in culture, is changing, but you would not, interview the truly radical fanatic for a story, because you'd be like, you know what, you are really too radical, you're too fringy. Or we would make sure that we went to, the poor mom on the street and talked to her, as well as the rich guy. Like, we are always making decisions about who we choose to put in our stories and cast them, and doing the best we can to say, this is all sides of this as best we can see it. And I think covering, the radical right and the Proud Boys, like, we can't not cover them. I mean, we cover the pressure they're putting on society as we know it. How the fringe is moving and getting bigger is a story, and we cover that. But I think you can't. I think if you sit down and look at like what you think a newspaper should cover from your point of view, that's more like, you can't give the Trump, you're giving too much air to Trump. What if it was reversed and the paper wasn't giving you, like, what if it was your issue that was getting, that say this side was running the paper, and it was like, oh, we are giving way too much to the trans community. That's a fringe group. You're not going to cover the trans community because we feel morally, it's like who's moral? What is the moral code here? And I don't know that that's our decision to make. We're trying to reflect how culture is making that decision. I mean, we have to, so I think it's, again, this is not a black and white thing. This is not, and I have seen people who are putting their opinion on Twitter and writing stuff, and then they get in trouble in our newsroom for doing that. If I can write a Me Too story about a person who's, but if I had been chummy with that person and said, this is the best restaurant ever, I love this restaurant, or this is terrific, and then I have to turn around and write a story about how that person is a sexual predator, it's just a weird, like, you just don't look that, like, you just look, I think you have to hold your bullets, because you never know who you're going to be covering later. You just have to not, and it's not about, and again, some of it's just journalists who came up in the, era of Instagram and of individual brands, and you do disseminate news and are in the mix in a very quick micro, environment, micro tweeting and all the things that you do. It's hard to go now when you're a journalist, please stop putting yourself out. It's a really tricky time. And we will come to some place that makes sense, that takes the radical, I think is a very radical position among some young journalists, that you have to write your opinion, and the very stodgy old Edward R. Murrow thing. I mean, hopefully we'll change because of it, because I think they're probably right in a lot of ways. There's some old tropes that we just got used to doing. So I don't know, it's a really crazy time. These are also kids who came up, in the culture wars, right? Where the fake news era, and we didn't come up in that, we came up where there was actually an agreed upon set of facts. And the paper was something like there was the tribal fire, right? We all would get around the same tribal fire, and at least That's what newspapers were, right? We all are in the common place to look at things, but we have no tribal fire anymore. We have 70,000 little tribal fires. Anyway, it's a super interesting time, and I can't wait to see what the kids do with it. Good luck.
Let's take one more question from Zoom, if there is one, and then we'll wrap it up. But first, you joined us. Do you have a question? Mhm.
How many it's like almost a horse race out there.
Mm.
And that I think is reflected at large. As you mentioned earlier, the Edward R. Murrow perspective that your bias major. But I think because our politics is so much more nowadays, we find ourselves at a moment where people either are in favor of like our current democratic form of government or they are not. And that, in my opinion, the news media is like failing its charge to defend by engaging.
So the question is journalism failing democracy? Was that, is that right? Okay.
No, especially by covering
politics.
everything like a horse race, shirts and
Covering
skins.
politics like-
Who's up, who's down, Republicans or Democrats.
Right.
Like, for example, like talking about restricted voting bills that passed Georgia, Texas as a fix for
Right,
Republicans
right.
instead of like
Mhm.
in a front.
Right, the way that-
Scorekeeping.
The way that we used to talk about the Civil War, right? The South lost the war. Well, really, not the North won. It's like the right thing won. Like I see what you're saying, it's it's not a football match. I don't know. Again, the more I'm around, the more I think that these issues are just new versions of something that has always been with us as we're trying to make democracy work. I think probably in the 60s and with the civil rights legislation, you probably had a lot of the same kinds of debate, maybe a little bit, not as in Kodachrome, but, I don't know. Are we failing democracy?
I don't know.
Probably.
I don't know if
Give it
we're
a shot.
I don't know if we're failing democracy, but by the way, it's Frank,
I
not
think-
Mr. Bruni.
I think democracy is failing democracy.
Well, no, but this is it's a really important thing you touched on. And I want to give a shout out to somebody who teaches here at the DeWitt Wallace Center, Margaret Sullivan, who's also media columnist for the Washington Post. She wrote a really great column a couple months ago, I think it was just a couple months ago, where she talked about the problem is we call people political reporters or politics reporters. We talk about politics as a beat, but we don't talk about government as a beat or government reporters. And that's very much the kind of thing you're noticing. If this is a contest,
Mhm.
if everything that happens is either a victory or a defeat for the Republicans or the Democrats, I am so sick. I mean, we are more than a year from the midterms. And for at least 4 months now, I can't read a day's political news, which again is called political news and not government news, without scads of observations about what impact this could have on the midterms, about whether, and it's like the fate of the reconciliation bill, the fate of the Build Back Better agenda. I read about that from the journalists covering it primarily in terms of what will this do to the Democrats' prospects in the midterms. What about the various things proposed in that legislation? Right. What about all the things in that legislation, whether you agree with them or not? And there are very legitimate debates about means testing, whether the money is going to the people who need it most. But at the end of the day, there's this list of things that would happen in society that would change the lives of Americans, that will either get enacted for better or for worse or not. And the coverage is seldom about that. It's about whether, if the Republicans stall this, they've improved their chances in the midterms. And that's what you're talking about. I do think the media has lost its way on that. And I am culpable myself, very, very culpable. I don't, is it failing democracy? It's not serving democracy. I don't think the media is the biggest problem with democracy. If we add the word social before media, maybe it is the biggest problem with democracy. But no, your point is extraordinarily well taken. And to go back, Margaret Sullivan has been far more eloquent on this than I am. So if you haven't read that, or if anyone in the Zoom audience hasn't read her on this, Google her on politics versus government reporting.
I think you're right. And some of it is just the speed of the cycle, right? So another analysis of how, the bridges being built will help jobs in this area. It's not like every day you want like, well, is this up? Is this down? Like, is the only way you have to, feed that fast beast is how will it, people speculating about how this will affect so some of it is just the news cycle nature and people not being able to like addicted to it, right? So,
Well, and that's a key point too, because I'm beating up on the media. Something I always like to point out, whether it's this question or something else, you are getting these days, you're getting a media closer to what you want than ever before, because the media has the tools to measure your engagement and interest as never before. People after the 2016 election, when I would kind of sometimes do public Q&As, people would say, why did we see so much Trump on CNN? Why did we see so much Trump in the New York Times? Why were columnists always writing about Trump? And the answer is because you're clicking on Trump. If you had all clicked, and I'm not saying that doesn't let us off the hook. We're supposed to do more than just rack up clicks, but we're also a business that needs to take audience engagement into account. And my point is that citizens themselves have a responsibility. If you want a different kind of news, you actually have more power to get that different kind of news than ever before, because when you click, you are being measured, you are being heard. And I always said, if you had clicked that quickly and that frequently on John Kasich, we'd be talking about why can't you guys shut up about John Kasich? So you really have some power and agency here. Let's see if we have one more Zoom question because we're over time.
Oh, we are over time.
And then we'll call it a,
Okay. No more
what?
questions in the
Oh,
chat?
so do you have any final words for our audience?
I did have one final thought that I am not, I think there's room for much more opinion-driven and point of view-driven journalism. And I read a lot of it, and there's a whole lot more than there ever was. I just wanted to say, I'm speaking for my institution, the New York Times. We practice a certain kind of journalism. So if you want to be a real opinion-driven journalist, probably not room in our news pages for you, but that does not mean that that's an invalid and important part of the journalism mix. So I just wanted to be clear that speaking about that and that I do, I read it, I consume a ton of point of view driven, but I'm a much more media savvy consumer. So I know, and I think kids now are much more, they're like, what's the source? Who's writing this? What's their motivation? Nobody ever talked to me about that when I was in middle school or high school, right? So that's media literacy is a thing now.
Yeah,
So I think,
important.
anyway, I just wanted to
Kim, thank
say
you
that.
very much for your time. Thank
Thank
all
you.
of you who joined us, and have a good evening.
thank you guys out there in the Zoom world. Marcy Ferris said it was so moving tonight. I love her.